Hi guys, Claudia Boleyn here, and today we're talking about the 16th of May, 1536. So yesterday, Anne and George had their trials, and they have been condemned to death. So the men, Weston, Smeaton, Brereton, Norris and George, have been informed by Kingston, who is the Constable of the Tower, that they are now able to write letters to their family because their execution is going to be tomorrow. So the only one of their letters that remains is the one from Francis Weston, so I'm going to read that to you. This is to his parents and to his wife. Father and mother and wife, I shall humbly desire you, for the salvation of my soul, to discharge me of this bill, and for to forgive me of all my offences that I have done to you, and in especial my wife, which I desire for the love of God to forgive me, and to pray for me, for I believe prayer will do me good. God's blessing have my children and mine, by me, a great offender of God. When he refers to this bill, he is talking about his debts. He wants his debts to be paid. Now, because we don't have George's letter, we don't know who he wrote to. Presumably, like Francis Weston, he wrote to his wife Jane and to his parents. Of course, his closest family member is already there in the Tower with him. So on the 16th of May, we have a letter that Kingston wrote to Thomas Cromwell, because he's constantly updating Thomas Cromwell on this. And this is him basically informing Cromwell that he has now informed the men, including George, that they are to die tomorrow. He writes, "The time is short, for the king supposes the gentlemen to die tomorrow, and my lord of Rochford, with the residue of gentlemen, and as yet without confession which I look for, but I have told my lord of Rochford that he be in readiness tomorrow to suffer execution, and so he accepts it very well, and will do his best to be ready, notwithstanding that he would have reserved his rights, which has not been used in especially here." Lord Rochford is George Boleyn's title, so when you hear me say Lord Rochford, I'm talking about George. So George is fully aware that he is going to be put to death tomorrow. At this point, he still doesn't know the means, so he doesn't know if he's going to be hanged, drawn and quartered, or if he's simply going to be beheaded. So what's his mental state like? Well, Kingston seems to imply that he's quite calm. In some ways, perhaps he's emotionally worn himself out. He gave that fantastic appearance at trial yesterday. It seems like at this point the fight is gone from him, and he accepts that he is going to die. He's come to terms with that. Something that we do know from sources, from letters that were written by Kingston to Thomas Cromwell, is that something that's preoccupying George at this time is the idea that he owes certain men money, and now he's in the Tower and his wealth is forfeit to the crown. He can't pay those people the money he owes them, and that's bothering him a lot. That might seem like an odd thing for him to be focused on at this time, when tomorrow he may well be tortured and he's definitely going to be murdered. But I think that actually seems quite normal psychologically, because if we think about a lot of people who discover that they're going to die quite soon, often their preoccupation is on getting their affairs in order. They want everything to be sorted out before they go. And in some ways, I suppose it's easier to think about getting those affairs in order than to have to really think about your death. And remember, George is powerless here. The king and Cromwell have made sure that he knows how powerless he is. So this is some small good that George can do. He can try and petition the king and say to him, please will you pay these debts for me out of my money that you're taking, or will you write the debts off completely, because these are men that will be worse off because of my death and they've done nothing wrong. Now, I've mentioned before that Sir William Kingston, who's the Constable of the Tower and is in charge of everything that's going on in the Tower at the moment, he's quite an interesting figure, because although he must be quite strong-stomached, and it seems like a particularly morbid job to have to do to oversee these executions, he does seem to be polite, he does seem to be considerate, and it seems to be his concern that things are done properly so that the prisoners don't have to go through any extra psychological torture. He wants everything sorted for them so that it runs smoothly. In some ways, there's almost something quite noble about that. But Kingston has spoken to George as he's spoken to the other prisoners, and he writes to Cromwell on the 16th of May, and he says, "Sir, the Lord Rochford much desires to speak with you, which touches his conscience much, as he says, wherein I pray you I may know your pleasure. For by cause of my promise made unto my said lord to do the same." So what this means is that Kingston has gone in to speak with George. He will have gone in to try and make things run as smoothly as possible, to see if George has any concerns, and George has said to him about his debts and that he wants them to be cleared. He wants to speak to someone about that. So he has asked if he can have an audience with Cromwell or to get a message to the king, and Kingston has promised him, as Constable of the Tower, that he will do his best to make sure that these concerns are seen to. Now, this is the first letter letter from Kingston on the 16th, but Kingston has actually already seen the king. That morning he went to the king to present the petitions of Lord Rochford, so his job was to communicate those concerns that George had to the king. So he will have informed the king that George's final wish is that his debts are paid because he can't pay them from the Tower. Now the fact that George then asks for an audience with Cromwell after that, and that Kingston also asks Cromwell to speak to George, would imply that the king has said no to this. So this is George's final wish, and the king has denied it. So in this second letter that Kingston writes to Cromwell, he says, "For the gentlemen, the sheriffs of London must make provision. And yet I hear of no writ, but they are all ready, and I trust clean to God. They shall have warning in the morning, and I shall send at once to Master Heritage for carpenters to make a scaffold of such height that all present may see it. You must help my Lord of Rochford's conscience for the monk, if need be. And also he spake to me for the Bishop of Dublin, for he must have of the said bishop £250. So at this point, Kingston is feeling such pity and compassion for George that he is begging Cromwell to please settle these debts for George. He wants George's conscience to be at ease before he has to go to his death. So he mentions the monk here, he mentions the Bishop of Dublin. These are two people that George owes money to. Now Claire Ridgway and Claire Cherry tell us that the king did not honour this final wish, and neither did Cromwell, and that in fact it's not until 1542, 6 years after George's death, that the Archbishop is released of this debt of £250, which is a large sum in Tudor times. Something else George does in the day before his execution is that he asks for the sacrament to swear on. So we discussed swearing on the sacrament before in terms of Henry Percy when he swore on the Blessed Sacrament to prove to everyone that he and Anne had not been pre-contracted. And George swears to his innocence on this sacrament. This is him giving a signal of his innocence, because in those religious times it would be extremely unlikely that someone, especially someone as religious as George, would put their immortal soul at risk by lying on the sacrament a mere day before they meet their death. And what about Anne? So Anne is not going to be executed until the 19th, so we are 3 days away from her death. Kingston once again is concerned, and he writes to the king on the 16th to ask what the plans for Anne's execution are. Is she to be burned at the stake, or is she to be beheaded? Because he needs to make ready for this. Now thankfully, as we know, Anne is not burned at the stake. In fact, Henry orders a French swordsman from Calais to perform the execution. So this would be a more dignified method of death, because if you are being beheaded in the traditional sense, you would have to put your head down on the block. With the French swordsman, Anne will be able to sit up, so there's a bit more dignity to it. And this will be spun as a sign of Henry's mercy to Anne. But actually what we know is that the king ordered this executioner from Calais days before the result of Anne's trial. So even before she was found guilty, the king knew that she was going to die, and he fully planned to have her executed. Now on this day, Anne has a visitor, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer. She is his patron. Remember that he's the Archbishop of Canterbury, and he's got into that position because of Anne and because of the Boleyn family. So he goes to see her to provide spiritual comfort, but that's not the only reason he's there. Anne will probably have been pleased to see him because she's not allowed to see her family. She's not allowed to talk to George, and Archbishop Cranmer was a friend of hers. But it seems the reason that Cranmer is allowed to have this visit with the Queen is that he has been sent by Thomas Cromwell. So Cromwell currently has a dilemma. Cromwell is the orchestrator of the plot. He needs to prove that Anne's marriage to Henry was invalid. Now this is important, because if Anne dies and her marriage is still considered valid to the king, then Elizabeth is still the heir, Princess Elizabeth, Anne's daughter. Henry wants any children he may have with Jane Seymour to be his heirs, so it's so important to Cromwell and the king that they can prove that his marriage to Anne was invalid in the first place. So now that Anne's sentence has been given, she has been found guilty, she is doomed either way. Cranmer, her friend, is sent in because it is probably thought that she'd be more likely to agree to do this if her friend asked her. What we do know is that this meeting that she had with Cranmer gave her hope. She ended up more hopeful after this meeting, so we're not completely sure what was said. Historians suppose that what Cranmer said to her was that if she agreed that her marriage was invalid and therefore made Elizabeth illegitimate, the king would offer her a more merciful death, so she could be beheaded rather than burned at the stake. Perhaps he even even implied that Anne would be spared if she signed this document and agreed to it. And this is a terrible choice for Anne, because in agreeing that her marriage was invalid, that then makes Elizabeth a bastard. But Anne is also a mother, and she has to think about this like a mother. She knows there's no way to fight her case now, and this is the one way that she believes she might be able to see Elizabeth again. There's a chance that she could be allowed to live and sent to a nunnery. Now, Anne's daughter Elizabeth is only 2 years old at this point. She's almost 3. Anne would be desperate to see her daughter again, and more importantly, to be there to protect her daughter. Anne has seen how cruel Henry can be to his illegitimate children, seen how cruel Henry has been to Mary, and Anne is even taking part in that cruelty towards Mary. She knows that that can happen to Elizabeth now. She doesn't want that to happen. She wants to be there for her. And I think Anne is intelligent enough to understand that even if she doesn't agree to this, the king will have his way anyway. He will find a way no matter what it takes. So it is said that Anne agreed to these terms and that she agreed that her marriage was invalid. Now, the way in which this was argued is that I spoke to you before about Thomas Cromwell desperately trying to find a way to make the marriage invalid, and he had remembered that Mary Boleyn, Anne's older sister, had been a mistress to the king. Now, this is an undeniable fact. This is public knowledge. Here, Cromwell has cracked it, because this is something that Anne can't argue. She would have to agree that, yes, her sister had been a mistress of the king. So I can't imagine what a horrible situation this must have been for Thomas Cranmer, going in to see his friend and his patron in such a terrible state. And he is her friend, he is her supporter, he's a supporter of her daughter Elizabeth, but he has actually been forced to take part in making this little girl illegitimate. The fact that Anne's mood seemed to lift after this meeting, and that she seemed to have hope, does imply to me that she was pleased to see Cranmer, and that he was kind to her, I hope. Now, in Kingston's letter to Cromwell from the 16th, he tells Cromwell that the Queen believes she will go to a nunnery and is in hope of life. Now, we don't know if this is because she has been promised that she will be able to live if she says her marriage is invalid. We don't know what Cranmer said to her, and also we don't know what Cromwell has said to Cranmer. It could be that Cranmer was also under the impression that he would be able to save Anne if he could get her to agree to this. That may have been how Thomas Cromwell got him to do it. But also remember how horrific and traumatic this situation is. It might be that Anne is going through a phase of hope because she thinks that the king couldn't possibly really murder her because he loved her so much. It's hard to know what sort of thing would go through your mind psychologically in a situation like that, isn't it? Okay, thank you for watching. I'll see you tomorrow for another video. It's going to be George Boleyn and the other gentleman's execution tomorrow. We actually have a reading performed for me by Dan, which I'm going to be able to play to you, which I'm excited for you to hear, and hopefully it will make the words come alive for you, because that's the aim of this series. I would love for people to come away from this and think of Anne and George as full, real people instead of just names in a story. Okay, I love you loads, and I'll see you tomorrow. Keep safe. Bye!